Hey everybody, back with a little bit more content from the Content Minds here on YouTube. Wanted to say first of all, thanks for everyone for commenting on the last video. I really enjoyed engaging with everybody. Today I wanted to talk briefly just about some of the kind of false dichotomy I see emerging or continuing to exist in a lot of the financial coverage of the election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, the 2024 presidential election. It seems like despite Trump's mismanagement of the economy, especially at the end of his administration, there continues to be this really interesting kind of trope that he's maybe because he's a businessman or I'm not sure a white male or has a lot of New York City connections. I'm frankly not sure what it is, considering how many businesses he's driven into the ground. But there seems to be this kind of trope that he's going to be better for the economy, and this continues to be where he holds a little bit of an edge over Kamala Harris in opinion polls and polling of the American public. And I found this really interesting. I mean, I think at this point, if you're looking at the data, you would conclude that he is far from a business genius. But I actually have another observation that I think is a lot more troubling than just kind of the run-of-the-mill Trump's administration did a bad job of managing the macroeconomic situation or even dealing with tariffs or anything like that. And that really is just to observe what he and his staff are telling us they want to do about the Federal Reserve. There have been some reports recently that he sees himself as needing to play more of a role if he regains the presidency on the board of the Federal Reserve, or maybe becoming sort of a second co-chair of the Fed. And in digging into this, you'll find that there was a leak from his sort of inner sanctum of advisors back in, I think, March or April, saying that they thought they really have a kind of a plan that they've laid out here to sort of subvert the Fed and insert more of their political opinions and policy preferences into the operation of the Fed. And this sounds really boring. I mean, as soon as you start talking about the Fed, I feel like people's eyes glaze over. But I think it's important. It's super important, and I'll kind of try to briefly and hopefully in a somewhat interesting way explain why. You really have in the United States a moat, a bifurcation of the system, of the sort of economic system, right? As a whole, it's divided into monetary and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy really being handled by Congress, obviously the people we appoint to control taxation and spending in the government. Monetary policy, however, just sort of the nuts and bolts of how the money system works, how much money supply there is in the economy, how much money is printed, and what the interest rate that you can gain off of that money is. That's really handed to the Fed, and this is done for a really important reason, and that reason is you really don't want interest rates or printing of money to be tied in any way to politics, sort of in an immediate sense. This is really true even in a kind of an authoritarian system. You want some division there, but in a democratic system, it's even more important because you have obviously people elected to office who have constituents who are going to have complaints, and those complaints can become political pressure that then gets pushed upon the central bank in this case to change how the monetary system functions. And because certain things that the central bank has to do, like raise or lower interest rates or print more or less money, because these things can have really outsized impact on people's lives, they can tend to be quite unpopular, even if they are for the good of the system overall. So decisions that are monetarily prudent really wouldn't be prudent for the immediate political career of an individual person, for example, Donald Trump. But of course, the Fed is incredibly powerful. It has, their policy making, which they, will always remind you, and Jerome Powell will always remind you, is driven by data and is driven by their sort of dual mandate to keep inflation in check and keep employment as high as possible, keep unemployment as low as possible. This mission is obviously central to how the country works, how the economy is performing for people, and as we've seen in this presidential race so far, the economy, despite the war in Gaza, despite healthcare, despite any number of things, despite technology changing rapidly, despite gun violence, the economy continues to be often the touchstone to politics for many people. This is really where macro policy and individual livelihood kind of collides. This is also why through Congress we have financial oversight of the Fed. We have the Government Accountability Office, we have financial audits, we have Senate approval for the folks, whoever it is that the president appoints to be the Fed chairman, in this case Jerome Powell. Obviously that comes from the president and is then supervised by Congress. And so in this way, the Fed is often a kind of a lightning rod for folks, especially on the far right, and in some circumstances the far left, as sort of this highly undemocratic agent in the system. I think that's largely overplayed. But again, I'm a person who thinks that moat and that separation between the Fed's monetary policy decision making and the political process, the democratic political process, I'm a person that believes that moat should exist to some degree, because sometimes these decisions need to be made. Paul Volcker in the late 70s, early 80s, really jacking up interest rates to get stagflation under control being an example. Sometimes this body is going to have to do things that is sort of unpopular, and that's really to maintain the credibility of the dollar and maintain the credibility of the financial system writ large. And really what you can see if this moat kind of breaks down is you have a loss of credibility, you have policy that's made, a monetary policy that's really not optimal in a statistical sense or a mathematical sense, and you can watch in the news, right, the expectations around when the Fed will raise rates or lower rates or do anything. I mean, this stuff is much scrutinized, right? This is how fortunes are made and maintained, and really how this entire thing works, right? So having that all be subject to the whim of one person, not to mention a relatively unhinged person, I think at this point in Donald Trump. You can listen to some of his recent interviews and wonder how we would expect this person to make prudent monetary policy if he was sitting on the board of the Fed. It's sort of a nightmare scenario in a lot of ways, just from a what decisions would get made standpoint. But I think it's even more troubling, outside of any one individual person. I wouldn't care if that person was Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or me or Trump or anybody. There's really the point of the video here isn't that Trump is spectacularly ill-qualified to be that person, although I think he obviously is. It's more that person can't be and should not be an elected person at all. And the reason for this, quite simply, is that we have a ton of examples of where this leads if that moat breaks down, if that independence of the central bank is removed, and investors and other folks watching the market come to not have the expectations that they used to have for its credibility and its reliability and its prudence and its data-driven kind of decision making. And really, does it have a dual mandate or not? If you insert this other influence, this political influence for sort of short-term gain and re-election chances and all these things, right? You no longer have a dual mandate. You have some kind of more complex system, and it's just much harder to predict. But if you look at Argentina in the 80s and in the 90s, if you look at Zimbabwe in the 2000s, there are a lot of examples here where once you have that moat breakdown, that wall breakdown, the expedient political needs of certain individuals takes over, and what you start to see is maybe there's pressure on the ruling party or ruling sets of individuals from pensioners, and so they want higher disbursements for their pension. This pushes the government to pressure the central bank to print more money, right? And this kind of sets off a cycle of inflation, devaluation of money, having to print more money, and so on, right? In Argentina, this really took more the form of just financing deficit spending, right? To cover bases of government expenditures. They printed money to make payments, and this kind of set off the same sort of system of hyperinflation. So when you have political pressures driving monetary policy, it stops being an objective monetary policy. It stops being a policy that's made in this very broad-based way to benefit as many people as possible in the system, and starts to become a tool used for particular political purposes. And I think that's really what scares me with Trump's suggestion, and what I think we should be seeing more kind of critical reflection on from the financial media in particular. Obviously, you see a lot of coverage on your CNBCs, your Forbeses of sort of how this economic policy plays out between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and often the conclusion is, well, one of these candidates is much better for us than the other. And I think if you really start to play out what the long-term impact would be of some of what Trump's planning, whether it's with tariffs or whether it's with the Fed, I'm actually much more afraid long-term of the impacts of those decisions from a Trump administration than a Harris administration. Quite frankly, if Donald Trump was able to succeed in appointing himself essentially as a board member of the Fed, that could have disastrous, catastrophic long-term consequences for not only our domestic economy, but the role of the dollar in the global world order. The global system would be heavily damaged by this kind of a move, right? Because the dollar would become much less predictable and much less credible as a store of wealth, because it would be totally subject to the whims of potentially one guy. So, I'm really curious for your thoughts on this, especially if you have a more conservative or sort of fiscal perspective. I'm always happy to engage with that in the comments when they come through. And again, as always, appreciate you watching. Thanks.